Welcome to Assets Unscripted. My name is Berend Booms and I am your host. And I'm excited to welcome to the podcast today Markus Göring, who is the Director of Asset Value Controlling at Vattenfall, for a conversation on how the organization is approaching maximizing its asset value and potential. Markus, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much for taking the time. First things first, could I ask you to please tell us a little bit about your role at Vattenfall, about the organization, and anything else that you would like to share about yourself?
Yes, of course. Thanks a lot first for the invitation. I'm happy to be here with you and talk about asset value and how we maximize it. Vattenfall is a utility. We are organized in different business areas, and I'm working for business area, customer, and solutions. So we are the business area that is facing towards our customers. We have a lot of customer contacts, and that's where one of our core missions is to support our customers decarbonize. Part of our business is we sell electricity and gas to our customers. We are in the e-mobility business where we have a lot of charging solutions available, but we also provide energy services to customers, specifically heat pumps, but also solar panels. My expertise is actually more in the asset area, and this is where in our business area we also have our district heating business. So we operate district heating in Sweden, in the Netherlands, and in UK. My team, Asset Value Controlling, it's an international team. We are a small team of experts, and we support the business in exactly maximizing the value. And we work across the full life cycle of the assets. So in my team, we are responsible for business cases of new projects. We manage the 5-year investment plan for our business area. We are also securing to have good project governance along the life cycle of projects. We do the project controlling, and another large part is that we hand over, we lead the transition from a project into the operational phase, which we call operational readiness. And we are working on different projects where we optimize the asset value during the operations and maintenance phase. As you can see, it's a wide range of topics, and that is actually what makes it quite exciting to work in that area. You're faced with a lot of challenges, but at the same time, you also cooperate with lots of colleagues, which makes it quite a fun area to work in. Yeah, and maybe personally, I'm living in Hamburg, Germany. I have a daughter who is 4 months old. We are quite happy about Sophia. And yeah, I'm married to my wife, Katerina.
Congratulations. I mean, as a fellow father, I know that, that comes with a lot of responsibilities, but you get so much in return. And it's, it's both a day and a nighttime job on top of what you're already doing at Vattenfall. Wonderful. That was a great introduction. Let me tell you, Markus, I have been looking forward to today incredibly, because I am getting ready for a very fun conversation, hopefully on maximizing asset value. So the first thing I want to ask you about is, how do you define asset value, right? And has that definition changed at all at Vattenfall over the recent years?
Well, that's a good question to start with. First of all, the definition did not change in the past years. What we see as asset value is more or less an asset is a value generating unit. And this is mainly about the financial impact. So you could more or less say, once we start with a project, you look at the net present value of an asset, you look at the net present value of the asset over the life cycle, and this is what we define as asset value. However, what you need to see is that, of course, this very strict definition of value, it's kind of complemented by a few other thoughts, and that is, of course, sustainability gets quite important for us at the company, but also security of supply. As we talk about district heating and we want to securely supply heat to our customers, we also have to consider the security of supply. So in the end, it's mainly about this kind of financial value, but there are, of course, other factors we need to consider when we talk about the value of an asset. It's a little bit more interesting if you think about this one. I would actually add to this question, what is an asset? Because that is what usually you could kind of think that there are different ways of looking at an asset. And just imagine district heating business. So we have our production asset. So you could say that there's a kind of an asset that produces heat, and some of the times also electricity when we talk about a combined heat and power asset. So we have production assets, and then we have the distribution assets, which is more or less the pipes in the ground. We have substations that you can call as an asset. And as we are in this case talking about a system, we actually also think the system as being an asset. So there are different perspectives that you kind of look at. And that is also where we're kind of coming to this definition of asset value. You can kind of take different perspectives as what is the asset value. Of course, if you look at the bigger system part, then the entire district heating is supposed to kind of be, NPV positive. In the end, we need to make money with that asset, but also being able to supply heat to our customers. Then, if you look at more or less the production assets, there you can also differentiate. You have baseload assets and you have peak assets. For both these asset types, we look a little bit differently at the value, because the baseload asset there, we are supposed to have a high value because those assets provide the baseload of heat to our customers. Whereas for the peak assets, these are usually utilized in hours where we have a higher heat demand, or maybe we have a problem in one of our assets. So for these peak assets, we usually look at a little less running hours. Nevertheless, they are still, of course, of high value to us.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And something you mentioned that I think is really interesting is how sustainability, plays into this context. And certainly when I stepped into asset management, many years ago, sustainability was mostly seen as a constraint, right? Something that you had to abide to. But over time, it has now more and more become this integral part of the value equation. So it's great to see that you guys at Vattenfall have integrated the same. And obviously, as you mentioned, you're looking at value creation across the entire life cycle. But there's also another side of that spectrum, right? So where is it that you find that most commonly organizations are starting to lose value in that life cycle without them even noticing?
I would actually say you probably do not notice when you lose value. I think as an organization, you will notice that you lose value on an asset.
Right.
However, if you think about this life cycle perspective, you can actually always lose value along the life cycle of an asset. And that is because it's with these assets, it's an investment you are making that is supposed to earn back in a couple of years. We're usually talking about 40 years payback, or kind of a lifespan of 40 years where we want to earn back our money. So losing value starts actually in the planning phase. Just imagine that nowadays you have to make assumptions for this asset for about 40 years. And that is a little bit like looking into the crystal ball. What assumptions do you take for earnings? What assumptions do you take on maintenance costs, etc.? So there we see, if you do a sensitivity analysis, we actually see a wide span on value that can be gained, but also lost over the lifetime. So that is where it starts. But then if you think it a little bit further, the execution of a project can also be quite tricky. That is where nowadays we see availability of suppliers is tight. Having the right people during the execution phase is always not so easy. So therefore, you can also lose a lot of value during the execution phase. What we do then is more or less we shift the engineering focus a little bit to the earlier phase, which we call front-end loading. So having a pretty good execution, a kind of planning phase, is supposed to have a smooth execution. So that is something where I would say if we look at our projects, we are also quite successful by having a very good execution of our projects. Well, and then there's the next part, and this is probably, if you look at an asset having 40 years, what I mentioned, lifetime, you might have 5 years project phase. So there's roughly 35 to 40 years where you operate and maintain your asset. And this is, of course, where you can do many things wrong. Just imagine that over that period of time, you need to do a lot of replacements of components. So you need to plan a replacement. Hopefully you do it well in advance and don't have any bigger breakdown of your components so that your asset is out of operations. So in the end, that is where I think you should have a strong focus on your asset management processes. How do you plan replacements? How do you do maintenance? Do you do more or less reactive maintenance, which is usually combined with a lot of breakdowns? Or do you go for a more preventive maintenance strategy where you look ahead and have a good planning of your maintenance activities? Well, and last but not least, that's usually something you should consider very much in the beginning. Some of the assets need to be decommissioned at the end of their lifetime. So also then, this is what we usually do in our business cases. We plan for the decommissioning so that you also include those costs in your planning. And I think that this is what when I look at asset management, where I'm usually in favor of having this holistic perspective on asset management, you need to be in control of the full life cycle. And that starts, like I said, with the assumptions in the beginning, and it goes until the decommissioning, because also during the decommissioning phase, if you don't do it right, you can still lose some value.
Absolutely, and it's an art and science, and there's no one blueprint that is always going to get you from A to Z without any hiccups, without any faults, without any failures. And some of the value killers that you mentioned, right? So the planning, project execution, decommissioning. Would you say that these are mostly or primarily people problems, process problems, or is it really a mix of the two?
It's definitely a mix of everything. I think when you look into these days, it's there is lots of things you need to do in terms of administration. Just think about permitting times. Nowadays, you have to do a lot of studies, which is good, but in the end, that kind of takes a lot of time to do. So in the end, the complexity in the project phase, but also during operations, it's high. So in the end, you need to be very much in control of your processes, but you also need to have good people. But, and that is another interesting thing that I think gets more and more important, or actually is already quite important, you need to be in control of your data, right? 100%. I mean, without being in control of your data and knowing where your asset is, where your condition of your asset is, you have a more or less a blind eye. So that's why I would actually say it's people, it's processes, but also you need to have a very good data strategy to be in control of not losing any value.
Absolutely, absolutely. I just want to get back to something you mentioned, the sort of lifespan expectancy of 40 years. Now, obviously, that is a really long time. And as you say, you cannot look into that crystal ball. I can imagine that sometimes playing the long game and having this long-term vision, it gets to be really hard to defend, right? Really hard to maintain. So how do you balance the long-term value creation that you're after with sort of the short-term performance requirements and some of the cost pressures that you have no doubt faced in these capital-intensive sectors like heat and energy and power?
Yes, that's a pretty interesting thought. I like to have, when I look at an asset, I like to think in a term like this asset has an earning capacity. There is an amount of value that this asset can create. And over the lifetime, it's the objective to maximize this value and not have too many losses. So that is the bigger thought. If you then take it a step further, managing your asset is about balancing performance, cost, and risk. it's usually this triangle that you need to balance out right. And that, of course, over a period of if we stick to those 40 years, you will see a different prioritization over the years. And we've seen that in the last years, where having Corona, then we were short on gas in Europe. You really were lucky if your asset was available. And their additional cost of having your asset available did not really matter, because the prices on the market were quite high.
Right.
So therefore, that is something that I usually say we must be very much aware of how our asset is performing, and then kind of how do we kind of assess the entire cost and risk situation. But taking your kind of question, I would actually say it starts with a long-term perspective. So you usually should have, if you have an asset, you should have an asset strategy. Kind of what is the asset about? Why do you actually have this asset? And what is kind of your positioning of this asset for its full lifetime? As said in the beginning, if we have a base load heat asset, then it's about having a high availability of this asset over the lifetime and providing as much heat as possible as base load. Well, this is then the strategy part, which is of course not kind of really being good for operations. What we usually then do is we have a 3 to 5 year more detailed plan of what we need to do for an asset. This is what we call an asset guideline. So this asset guideline describes our 3 to 5 year priority for a specific asset. It could be that we face a major outage, and the focus in kind of 3 years from now is a major outage that we need to manage. It could be a bigger replacement. It could be some other kind of project that we prioritize. Or it could be kind of that and that was the case a couple of years ago, where in these guidelines, we also prioritized a criticality analysis. Once we have a new asset, we usually do a criticality analysis to kind of get our starting point straight. So this is then when we come from the strategy to the guideline, where we have the basics to keep the focus for an asset. However, and then we more or less come to the yearly perspective. So throughout a year, we follow a yearly cycle, where in the beginning of the year, we start with a more or less strategy for the asset. So what's happening this year? What's on the agenda? What do we expect? What is the target for an asset? There we usually look at KPIs, availabilities, etc. And based on this, we kind of then execute and plan revisions, plan availabilities, plan maintenance, etc. So I would say this methodology, if you kind of start from the long-term perspective to the yearly planning, helps you a lot to be in control. However, I think the most essential part you then need to do is you need to also be very much in control of your maintenance, because that is where usually, if you look at the cost of an asset, it's people and it's maintenance. And if you take the people part away and say that is optimized, then usually when you face a cost challenge, it's about maintenance. So you better know how you plan and steer your maintenance, because that is in these days where you usually get lots of challenges, and you need to make short-term adjustments, and where you need to kind of have a good maintenance management system to be in control of keeping the asset up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how you explain how you can go from this more long-term vision to a granular view that zooms into, on a year-by-year basis, what is it that we want the asset to deliver? What is the value that we're expecting the asset to deliver? And then we can actually start to benchmark and look at some of the KPIs. I mean, it's really about how do you make some of those long-term benefits and consequences visible so that they can start to compete with the attention that usually goes towards the more prominent, year-on-year KPIs. So it's a really smart way to think about things. I want to ask you about being in control. Right? And you mentioned that maintenance obviously is really important. So risk avoidance, I would say, is also one of those important factors, right? Looking at risk, thinking about how risk plays into maintenance. And I know from talking to you that risk-based maintenance is somewhat of a sort of recurring theme in your career. So when it comes to risk-based maintenance, where do you see risk-based adding the most value today?
I think when you look at maintenance of an asset, I mean, there are different maintenance strategies. You can do reactive maintenance, so you have a failure and then you repair it once the failure happens. And you can kind of do preventive maintenance where you kind of either follow time-based maintenance. Every year we do X, Y, Z. Right. Or you can do more or less a condition-based maintenance, where you kind of based on the condition of a certain component, you do your maintenance. I think for me, risk-based maintenance, there's not really a choice of whether to have it in place for some part of your asset or not. I would say you should, if you have an asset, you should definitely do risk-based maintenance. Because in the end, your asset, just think that you have a design of your asset, so everything in your asset has a certain function and has a meaning. So there's nothing in your asset where you can say, well, we don't need that part. That's otherwise, I mean, you would probably have just too much money if you would do it like that way. So I would say if you have such an asset, every component, every system of your asset has an objective, has a function to fulfill. And therefore, when you have a maintenance strategy, you need to cover your entire asset with this maintenance strategy. And that is, I mean, that is where in the end you of course differentiate, but that is not about the bigger picture, but it's about different parts of your asset where you can differentiate. And that's where we do a criticality analysis, where we kind of follow a little bit a structured methodology. So we have our experts coming together. We do an assessment of our asset, and we kind of say what parts of the asset are critical, which parts of the asset do we really need to have in focus, and some other parts we might have less in focus. And based then on this kind of criticality assessment, as a next step, we define the different risks and set up our risk-based maintenance. And that is, of course, where you kind of come to this point of, yeah, you need to have kind of some idea on a certain risk. So if you think about a biomass asset, you have a fuel handling system. What happens if my fuel handling system fails? And there can be several reasons for why your fuel handling system will fail. And based on this kind of assessment, so take, for example, you have a little bit quality issues in your biomass. So you have two big pieces of biomass, or kind of you have two wet biomass, and you kind of then have a problem in your fuel system, and you kind of get a blockage in your fuel system, which happens, by the way, more or less regularly if you don't have good fuel quality. Right. So that is where you then make an assessment on, okay, how likely is this to happen? And then you have a discussion about what you can do about it. You might have a different technical design. Well, if the asset is already running, you have to change your system design. But otherwise, you can talk about operative measures or even maintenance activities. So then you have probably a discussion. You have an assessment. We do it on a qualitative basis in the beginning, where we have a risk matrix describing a little bit the risk that we foresee. Then we kind of discuss what activities do we want to do. And if you combine your starting risk with the activity you want to do, you kind of get to a risk mitigation. So this is an activity we do in an extensive way for the critical parts of our assets. Whereas for the non-critical parts, you might say we do it quick and dirty. So we don't spend that much effort on those parts of our assets. But we kind of do it quick and dirty so that we come up with a basic maintenance plan. So in the end, based on this methodology, what we see is that we are able to be very much in control of our maintenance. We have a very good balance where I would say more than 40%, maybe 50%, we do more or less on a condition based maintenance strategy. We do maybe 30% on a more or less time-planned maintenance strategy basis, and the rest is reactive maintenance, where we just let things fail, so they are not really critical to the output of our asset, and then we can do maintenance. The interesting part is that you do this once, and then you have set it up. And that is where it gets interesting, and that is where it also connects to your previous question. Once you have this methodology set up, you have your starting point to improve.
Right.
And that is where in the end, you need to take a little bit of effort to get to the starting point, setting up your risk-based maintenance system, getting the structure in place. And then based on this, you can optimize, and you can also optimize the value over the lifetime of your asset.
Absolutely. And, being in control is wonderful, but obviously you don't start out day one being in control. Most organizations, they start out with this very reactive sort of firefighting mode. They're constantly reacting to failures, and it's really hard to break out of that. So may I please ask you if there is some sort of common pitfall that you see organizations that are shifting from this reactive sort of compliance-driven maintenance to being more in control and trying to apply these risk-informed decision-making principles. Is there something that always happens to them, that always seems to go wrong for them?
Yes, I think the most common pitfall is to think that setting this up comes at no cost.
Right.
And it happens somehow. And if you think usually in the terms of, you have a project organization that delivers on the project, and you have a receiving organization that is more or less taking the asset for operations and maintenance. And the project usually wants to deliver on the project. Once it's handed over, they are gone up to the next project.
Yep.
And the operations part, those colleagues are usually very much looking at day-to-day operations, and they expect that they get a good project delivered, which actually has these kind of things in place. So that is where usually what we do to mitigate this is we what I mentioned in the beginning with my introduction, we do operational readiness. So that's where for a couple of years now, we involve people from operations already in the project phase. And that is where during the project phase, they are supposed to bring in the operational perspective. What do we need in terms of operations and maintenance? It's quite simple. We have a long checklist of items that we want to see being in place. It starts from documentation, but also our maintenance management system structure, the KKS structure, must be in place.
Right.
Maintenance plans, in the best case, should be there. So in the end, let me be honest, we are not successful in taking over projects into operations. We don't have all these things in place. However, what we have is we know where our gaps are. And I think that is at least helpful, because you kind of finalize a project. Those people can move on and go to the next project, and our operations already know what they got and where the gaps are. They are, of course, also not happy about having too many gaps, because it's
Sure.
their effort, and they need to spend time and money on filling those gaps. But in the end, that is where we see big improvements over the past years.
And I love to hear it. I think, it's this really interesting perspective that I hear a lot when I talk to big organizations. The ones that are really successful, they realize that it's about more than just investing in tools or technology, right, or in software. It's at the same time investing in people and getting the right people at the table that have those insights, and making sure that sort of that behavioral change that comes with some of these approaches and some of the maintenance strategies that you're trying to apply is accounted for, right? Because you can project plan all you want, but if the people that are meant to be using it do not stand to benefit, then yeah, it's on to the next project, and the project is sort of doomed to fail from the start. It's really interesting. Something you mentioned in the beginning of our conversation that I want to get back to you on is data. And you could not have picked a better person to talk about data. Honestly, it's one of my favorite topics to talk about. The reason I'm so excited by data is, I think, first of all, it's tremendously powerful. It has tremendous potential, but especially in this day and age where we live, where, you know, artificial intelligence is all around us, right? And it's all everyone seems to be talking about. And, you know, everyone is mentioning how artificial intelligence is going to transform the world. It's going to transform the industry. It's going to transform the way that we work. But I'm of the opinion that, you know, data has that sort of compounding effect. It's going to be the catalyst that makes a lot of these, you know, incredible breakthroughs, makes it possible. So I wanted to sort of pick your brain on data. How do you use data to prioritize what you do? How do you prioritize risk? How do you prioritize value using data? And is there already perhaps some sort of, you know, impact that you can sort of assign to AI? Is AI already having an impact on what you're doing with value creation?
That's a tricky one. I think nowadays, if you don't see data as an asset, you do something wrong. I think any organization that operates assets and or owns assets, there must be a data governance strategy in place. How do you maintain data? How do you structure your data? How do you kind of keep the quality up? This is definitely a must-have. However, reality is a little bit different, and it starts again with the project. The project has a target, and they usually don't foresee that such an asset must be operated for 40 years. So they might be saving on sensors, so you might not have all of the data available. They might just have not the best contract with the supplier, so maybe also the supplier didn't provide all the sensors for a specific component, a pump or a valve, to monitor the condition in a perfect way. So in the end, I would say what I see is that in theory, I can fully follow the thinking behind data and AI. In a perfect world, we have all the data available. We can build nice models around it. We can have nice statistics, and we kind of can get to good conclusions. But I think reality is just a little bit different. We don't have that seamless data flow. We don't have all the data available. And something that I experienced in the past, we were doing some projects on predictive maintenance. Kind of, we really said, okay, let's see how far we can get with predictive maintenance. So can we really predict when a certain component fails? It was good projects, but we didn't get a good outcome of this.
Okay.
I think we were too ambitious, and in the end, we failed in getting a good outcome. And one of the challenges we just saw is that in real life, we missed training data because we took kind of one relevant component that we had no redundancy, and our operations and maintenance people, they keep this component alive, and therefore we had no data about any asset failure at all. So how do you then want to train your algorithm to kind of predict a failure? And that is a little bit, I would say, the tricky situation we are facing, that if you look at reality, the required data is in the asset area not available to utilize all the algorithms and to really work in artificial intelligence.
Yep.
I think what's still missing, and that is, I think, a more complex exercise, and I think that will still take a couple of years until we get there. But I think what we need is we need to have a better planning of the data strategy in the project lifecycle. So when we do a project, when we plan an asset, I think that's the point where you need to plan a holistic data strategy, already having all the algorithms in mind that you might want to use during the O&M phase.
Yeah, That's a really smart suggestion, because you're almost getting into this territory of it being a chicken and an egg story, right? Where we can see that AI is going to excel, but how is it going to excel? It's going to need this clean, qualitative, provided data. But then at the same time, we're applying now AI to create some of the data for us, to structure the data, to clean the data, etc. So yeah, to move it along, I think it's really wise to include that much more, early on in some of those planning phases.
But don't get me wrong, Berend. I'm not too scared. I mean, I think it's just a long way until we get there.
Right. I hear you.
What I definitely see, and where I think it makes a lot of sense to take steps in using a better data management and giving AI and some smart algorithms a chance, is you need very specific applications. So what we, for example, in district heating, what's quite relevant for us is heat and water losses. Mm-hmm. So that's one of our areas where we are focusing on to minimize these losses. But therefore, kind of with this very specific application, kind of we focus on installing more sensors, getting our data quality up, and then kind of using algorithms to improve our understanding on the condition. Plus, and I would say what we also see, taking this example, as we have quite some grids in our portfolio, we have enough data to utilize to improve our losses. Right. And I think that is where I would say, if you take the big picture, it's a challenge, and it definitely needs more time and probably a better planning. But what I also believe in, take small steps, make it a very specific application where you really have value, and then focus on this application and implement an improvement, get more data, get more structured data, and then experiment with algorithms and try to predict the condition of that specific application.
So you're saying that we should start small, but we dream big, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. And I love this, because, one thing that I've come to realize over the time is that we're now trying to solve all of these very complex questions, very complex challenges, using AI that is probably going to be the worst version of AI that we're ever going to work with. So as you say, right, it needs time, and over time, those algorithms and those models are going to be more proficient. They're going to be more integrated. The data provision is going to be better. So it's really exciting to think about what is going to be possible in the future through all of this.
Indeed.
Okay. Very inspirational. I always get inspired talking to leaders like yourself. So I want to ask you about leadership next, right? How would you describe the role that leaders or leadership plays in positioning asset management, or making asset management more visible as a strategic capability, I would say, instead of it just being sort of an executing technical kind of function where people go, okay, well, obviously you need maintenance, but how does it turn into a driver of value?
For me, asset management is based on a couple of good principles. It's about transparency. It's about having a common documented information basis of your asset. It's about alignment. It's about breaking up silos. Right. It's about line of sight. So it's combining more or less the strategy of a company to day-to-day activities. And my experience over the past years is that leaders in asset management, if they hold up these principles, the company will have better results. Mm-hmm. Because these kind of principles are definitely true. Just think about silos. It's so simple to work in your silo, and that is a common pitfall that I think many organizations have. And therefore, it's not an easy task. But I believe that the leaders must bring the people together. They must break up those silos, to take that example, and then in the end, the outcome will be better. So for me, the asset management, or it's leadership, it's kind of a generic thinking there. They must hold up these principles and keep the organization following these principles. We have one one discussion where my team is also heavily involved is if you think about business cases and the assumptions, and having the assumptions being very important for the future of an asset, of a project. What we believe in is assumptions must be owned by someone. So if I find an assumption in a business case where I don't see the owner who's an expert in kind of his domain, then we say, well, we can't accept that business case because we miss an owner of such an assumption. So I usually want to have everybody involved in doing the business cases who have a say in it, and then kind of base the decision on a business case. I don't want it to be isolated in a certain silo, but I believe if you take the different experts and the different people together into the decision making, you will in the end make a better decision, because then you can trust your assumptions are being kind of valid. They're kind of based on a kind of expert who has a good view on that specific assumption. And I think that is where leadership gets quite important. It's not an easy one because you always need to kind of hold these principles up. And sometimes it's also not the easy way, but you have to kind of, you have to kind of keep the discipline to take those discussions and then secure that those principles are followed.
But it's work worth doing. You know, the outcome, how you foster the alignment between, you know, getting those different silos, the different departments aligned towards that shared common goal. You know, that is what builds innovation, that builds progress, and that helps you and the organization and the departments to move along, which is great. So can I ask you this about assumptions and beliefs, right? So you have been in the industry for many, many years. And I wanted to ask you if there's a belief, an assumption that you have or had about assets, about maintenance, about value that you thought was true, but that you have now come back on.
I would actually challenge that question because, or maybe it's me personally, but I don't believe in beliefs. I think it's what I rather believe in is that we have a continuous development. I think the world is not standing still, and therefore I believe that what you thought about today is not valid tomorrow, or might not be valid tomorrow anymore.
Right.
I think I gave the example with predictive maintenance. When I worked on this topic a couple of years ago, I was very enthusiastic about it. I was pushing the organization and I was really kind of, hey, let's do it, let's try it. As said, the outcome was a little bit disappointing, I would say. However, it was more or less a good learning for the organization. Another thing where I think we learned a lot as an organization is the certification of our asset management system. I think that is where usually a certification can add a lot of value.
Right.
But what we did is we discussed about a certification. So let's do the certification. And we had lots of discussion about doing a certification, which in the end, when you looked at that time, it wasn't really beneficial for the organization. It was a lot of waste and it was a lot of, it didn't bring us any further.
Yeah.
So what I nowadays say is, okay, we might have certification of our asset management system somewhere in our mind. And I'm happy to see if kind of people understand the asset management structure. But what I then prefer is let's do the right things.
Right.
Let's structure our maintenance in a good way. Let's get a good investment steering in place. Let's have a good risk matrix and let's discuss about risks. And this is in the end adding the value to the organization. Whereas talking about a certification or talking too much about theory is not helping too much.
Right. And it's not a one and done exercise. I mean, it's not something that you do once and then you never look at it again. It is something, as you say, you know, you continuously pay attention to, and that is how you progress towards the future.
Yes.
Okay, so final thing that I want to ask you about is that future, right? I'm working on the future of assets platform, so I'm constantly thinking about what is still to come. What I want to ask you is to look ahead to the next, let's say 12 to 18 months. What are some of the shifts that you see coming your way, or to leaders in general in our space, that they're definitely going to have to face and that they need to make sure that they're prepared for?
Yeah, for me, the key word here is resilience. And I think we touched upon many good thoughts in our talk. It's about short-term prioritization of performance risk or cost. It's about managing your data and knowing where your asset condition is. And the reason for why I think this is so important is if we just look around us, the entire geopolitical instability we have at the moment worldwide, the economics in Europe are not easiest at the moment. We have, I think, in Central Europe, we have lots of negative news out there. Yep. And I think this is where organizations must be resilient. They must be in control of their processes. They must be in control of their supply chain. And I think it's a little bit like, you need to prepare yourself for a possible, likely, whatever unexpected thing to happen.
Expect the unexpected.
Exactly, expect the unexpected. And I think this is where we need to stay alert, and we need to be in control of our processes, of our organization, and we have to have a good view on what's happening around us.
Absolutely. So just one more final question, because I just thought of this and I think it would be fun. Let's assume that, I come to work for Vattenfall, we're in the same team, and I get to give you a carte blanche budget. You can spend it on whatever you want, but you can pick only one thing. So if you had to go all in 2026 to build something out, right? What a capability, a vision, what is it that you would spend your full budget on?
That makes me think a lot. And I would really connect this to the capability of the organization to be resilient. I think that is at least something where in this phase, having all the insecurity around us, I think resilience is key for the next year, next 2 years to come. So therefore, I think if I had such a budget, I would spend it on that area.
I think it's a wonderful area to spend it on. Thank you so much for your wonderful insights. Markus, thank you for coming on and sharing. I really appreciate you. Now, you can find more insights like these by visiting the home of the Assets Unscripted podcast on futureofassets.com. Future of Assets is published in partnership with IFS and Ultimo. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.